Good morning. I'm Stephen Leake. I'm an elder at First Presbyterian Church in Mesquite, Texas, and I'm also one of the teachers of the Discipleship Sunday School class there. Today we continue with our study of the Gospel of John. And I'd like to remind you that our curriculum is based upon the daily Bible study series by Professor William Barclay, and that we're using the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible for our scripture readings. Now, last week, we began chapter 18. And the way Professor Barclay teaches chapter 18 is that he takes the passages of the trial of Jesus before Caiaphas and puts those passages together. And then he takes the passages about Peter's denial of Jesus and puts those passages together. Last week we studied the trial of Jesus before Caiaphas, and today we're going to study the denial of Jesus by Peter. So we'll be putting two different scripture readings together with our commentary lesson. Our scripture readings today are John 18, 15 through 18, and then we'll skip to 25 through 27. Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter was standing outside the gate. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out, spoke to the woman who guarded the gate, and brought Peter in. The woman said to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the slaves and the police had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing around it, warming themselves. Peter also was standing with them and warming himself. Now we'll skip to verse 25. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. They asked him, "You are not also one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." And one of the slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment, the cock crowed. When the other disciples forsook Jesus and fled, Peter refused to do so. He followed Jesus even after his arrest because he could not tear himself away. So he came to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. He was in the company of another disciple who had the right of entry to the house because he was known to the high priest. And there have been many speculations about who this other disciple was. Some have thought that he was simply some unknown disciple. Some have connected him with Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea, who were both members of the Sanhedrin. Both must have known the high priest well. One very interesting suggestion is that it was Judas Iscariot. Judas must have been around the house to arrange the betrayal and would have been well known to the servants and Caiaphas, the high priest himself. The one thing that seems to invalidate this theory is that after the scene in the garden, Judas' part in the betrayal must have been quite clear, and it is almost incredible that Peter would have had anything more to do with him. The traditional view is that the unnamed disciple was John himself, and the tradition is so strong that it's difficult to set aside. The question becomes, how could John from Galilee be known, apparently intimately, to the high priest? Two suggestions have been made to explain this. First, in later days, a man called Polycrates wrote about the fourth gospel. He never doubted that John wrote the gospel and that he was the beloved disciple, but he says a very curious thing about this. He says that John was by birth a priest and that he wore the patalos, which was the narrow gold band or ziz, inscribed with these words, Holiness unto the Lord, which the high priest wore upon his forehead. If that were so, John would actually be a member of the high priest's family. But it's difficult to believe that he could be of the priestly line, for the Gospels clearly show him as a Galilean fisherman. Second, it's clear that John's father had a flourishing business because he could afford to hire servants. That from Mark chapter 1, verse 20. One of the great Galilean industries was saltfish. Fresh fish was a great luxury because there was no way to transport fish in such a way that it could remain fresh. Saltfish was a staple article of the Palestinian diet. It has been supposed that John's father was in the saltfish trade and that he supplied the household of the high priest. If that were so, John would be well known to the high priest and his servants because he would have made deliveries there for his family. Peter was brought into the courtyard of the high priest's house, and there he denied his Lord 3 times. There is this very interesting thing. Jesus had said that Peter would deny him 3 times before the cock crowed. And there are some difficulties about that. According to Jewish ritual law, it was not lawful to keep cocks in the holy city, although we cannot be sure whether or not that law was kept. Further, it's never possible to be sure that a cock will crow. But the Romans had a certain military practice. The night was divided into 4 watches, 6 p.m. to 9 p.m., 9 p.m. to midnight, 12 midnight to 3 a.m., and 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. And after the 3rd watch, the guard was changed. And to mark that, there was a trumpet call at 3 a.m. And that trumpet call was called cockcrow. It may be that Jesus said to Peter, before the trumpet sounds the cockcrow, you will deny me 3 times. And everyone in Jerusalem must have known that trumpet call at 3 a.m. When it sounded throughout the city that night, Peter must have remembered. So in the courtyard of the high priest's house, Peter denied his Lord. But no man has ever been so unjustly treated as Peter by preachers and commentators. They always stress his failure and his shame, but there are other things that we must remember. First, we must remember that all the other disciples, except John, if he's the unnamed disciple, had forsaken Jesus and fled. Think about what Peter had done. He alone drew his sword against fearful odds in the garden, and he alone followed to the end. The first thing to remember about Peter is not his failure, but the courage which kept him near to Jesus when everyone ran away. His failure could have happened only to a man of superlative courage. True, he failed, but he failed in a situation which none of the others even dared to face. He failed not because he was a coward, but because he was brave. Second, we must remember how much Peter loved Jesus. The others had abandoned Jesus. Peter alone stood by him. He loved Jesus so much that he could not leave him. Third, we must remember how Peter redeemed himself. Things could not have been easy for him. The story of his denial would get out, for people love a malicious tale. But Peter had the courage and the tenacity of purpose to redeem himself. The essence of the matter was that it was the real Peter who protested his loyalty in the upper room. It was the real Peter who drew his sword in the garden. It was the real Peter who followed Jesus because he could not allow Jesus to go alone. But it was not the real Peter who cracked under the scrutiny and questioning and denied his Lord. And that is what Jesus could see. A tremendous thing about Jesus is that beneath all our failures, He sees the real person. He loves us in spite of what we do because he loves us, not for what we are, but for what we have in us to become. The forgiving love of Jesus is so great that he sees our real personality, not in our faithlessness, but in our loyalty, not in our defeat by sin, but in our pursuit of goodness, even when we have been defeated. Thanks for joining me again today. God bless each and every one of you.